Hi everyone. First off, I want to say thank you for tuning into this video. This will be a little bit of a workshop slash a little bit of an insight as to how you're able to prepare for this upcoming weekend for the Malaya Inter-School Debate Championship. So before that, I just want to introduce myself. I am a part of the Education Core. My name is Sarah Aston, and I've been a debater for a few years now, which means the stuff that I'm going to talk about today within our workshop basically encapsulates a lot of the things that I feel is important, specifically if you are within the high school or the rookie status, or even if you are planning to really debate competitively as to how you're able to improve just a lot more better and just a lot more organically. So for today, without any delay, I think we can just jump into it. I think this topic that I will be sharing with everyone today before I share my screen is something that would basically be able to help you guys a lot, simply because this is quite of a general workshop that fits a lot of people's, I guess, interests. In this, we're talking about how to debate tricky motions and how exactly do we try to win in these instances. Let me share my screen. Right. So in this situation, we're going to talk about how do we debate tricky motions and how do we win. I want to give a shout out to Umar, who is also part of our education core for this tournament, who is very, very kind enough to give us this slide that we are now discussing on. So few things that I want you guys to take note of as we dive into, understanding how exactly should we try to debate tricky motions and how do we aim to win these types of motions. So if you need a pen and a paper, or if you are transcripting it on your docs, this is the right time for you to be prepared, um, because I will start. Okay, so let's discuss on how the government side would work on this house would ban smoking. So please note, the reason as to why I think this workshop is a really good one is because often and not, we tend to like, I don't know if you're the super nerdy, but you tend to like watch workshop videos where the speakers are like literally speaking of things that you yourself are unable to imagine how the debate plays out. So for the purpose of this particular lecture or like this workshop, what I'll try to do here is we'll only be using very simple and very easily for people to basically kind of imagine how to go about the motion. So for example, in this first slide here, we have this house would ban smoking. It's a very, very um, classic motion. We can see that it's a policy motion, which is why we're going to dive into that particular part as well. All right, so let's get started. So there are a couple ways that we can try to discuss on the simple terms of how to ban smoking. So of course, firstly, the most intuitive idea that you probably get is that you're going to have health diseases, right? And this type of health diseases, I think number one is intuitive for speakers to find. And more often than not, of course, when it comes to like cigarettes, when it comes to smoking in general, it often targets your lungs firstly, right? So if we look into the first one here, we can see that things like lung cancer, things like heart disease, things like diabetes are one of the often leading causes of death worldwide. So this is an important thing for teams to be able to kind of understand or realize. So this is something that you need to be able to flag out even when you are trying to prepare during prep time. And this is the type of thing which is also intuitive for judges to buy, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you should just end it on, for example, the analysis being diseases, but rather characterize as to what exactly could these health diseases be. In this instance, it's the lung cancer, it's the heart disease, it's the diabetes that necessarily happens, right? Now, if you look into the second premise here, it's very important as well because you're also introducing, like within your first like premise, you are also introducing a second like stakeholder necessarily, which are basically secondhand smokers. So for example, of course, you are able to identify something similar in terms of like the most proximate to smokers, but it also, for example, in terms of proving that particular harm, you're also proving why it also affects people around you who then become secondhand smokers. So of course, this is specifically for this house would ban, like, smoking. But if you can see this, you like, can you imagine how this is exactly how you want to be able to, I guess, garner that particular foundation in debating, and specifically when you are trying to kind of like create that first premise. Is very important for you to find these particular things, right? So I don't want to dive into this too much because it's very self-explanatory. What I want you to see here is that these 2 points are able to prove to the judge how you are able to, give the grounding on health diseases. Now, the second thing is, of course, on addiction. I think this is also quite intuitive, but perhaps the difference if you are still new to debating, or if you are not super, I guess, conscious in how like cigarettes and how smoking affects your body, there's nicotine, and therefore there's addiction. So now, if you look into the first point here, it talks about how tobacco companies often target youth through advertising, marketing, and flavored products. Now, if you notice, this doesn't directly engage to going in to tell the judge how does it create addiction, but rather it provides to you the premise as to, and like the stakeholder that is important, that plays a big role within your particular motion, right? Which is simply these particular tobacco companies and how they are able to, for example, trap or just target specifically youth and just younger, like, cigarette users to be able to opt into their product or to opt into smoking, for example, right? Now, this is when you are able to talk about, for example, cigarettes having nicotine, and this nicotine being extremely addicting, or just an inducing like addiction, like form of chemical in it. So here's the tip that I would like work on is, for example, if you are talking about how, um, you know, cigarettes have nicotine, this is important for you to be able to flag out, because number one, you have proven that these tobacco companies are the ones who are able to, for example, platform their products through like advertising, through marketing, and all of these things. And when you bring up the second point, which is simply on how they have nicotine within like a cigarette, or within, now we have like vapes and e-cigarettes. This is really, really important. So flag this out, make it really structured, and therefore it's clear for me to, for like the judge, to see that you are proving addiction for that premise. Lastly, is this simple idea on how smokers has become too addicted and relying on cigarettes, which means there isn't any opt-out mechanism. So even if there was an opt-out mechanism, maybe they can go for a form of therapy, or maybe they can go for a form of like, I think there's like nicotine patches, there's like therapy, there are like simply like just changing to the healthier lifestyle. Yes, perhaps those alternatives exist, but it's very, very hard for those alternatives to actually uh, work, or for example, to actually be something that is accessible for a lot of people who are, for example, already addicted. Which means on government side, you have a bigger form of like winning angle. So this is a little bit about meta, which is like this, which is the strategy, right? Which is, even if opposition can prove that people are always able to opt out anytime they want, more often than not, the larger majority of these stakeholders often, get too deep into the hole, which means it's hard for them now to not be reliant on cigarettes. So you push a higher burden on team opposition. Okay, now let's look into the third reason, which is economic harms. So when we talk about economic harms here, I think it's pretty self-explanatory, but rather it depends on how teams are able to extrapolate the idea of economic harms. So what I mean here is, when we talk about like smoking in general, and if you look into the first premise on the slide, where smoking places pressure on healthcare systems as smokers require like more medical treatment. So this is something similar to what I stated just now previously when it comes to the strategy, right? So even if people can opt out, most people are already too deep into the hole, which means they are a lot more reliant on cigarettes. So this idea here is how our healthcare now becomes an important premise for you to identify. So what teams often do is they just stop at the analysis of saying like medical treatments are expensive, but there's like a stronger point that is able to be extrapolated here, which is the idea of economic harms. So, for example, if you look into your first premise or your first, like, it could be an argument as well. If you look into your first argument, for example, when it comes to like health diseases, we're talking about lungs, right? So this could be cancerous as well. So probably you would have to go through respiratory like treatments, right? You probably would be a lot more prone to things like diabetes, which means that you probably need insulin, or you need, for example, a like permanent type of treatment, even if it comes through like medication, which means this is a whole medical treatment that you are able to characterize and show a form of urgency to the judge, right? So if you're able to do this, this means that you're able to prove that economic harm, firstly, just in terms of like the smoker's POV, but this dives in nicely and will conclude nicely with the second premise here, which is that this is money that could be more productively used, such as the government's investing into schools, hospitals, and roads. So the idea here is, like, number one, like I said just now, you are proving that this affects the smokers like own pocket, but it also affects the government, because it means that, for like, it means that they have to, you know, have a lot more of like treatments or beds specifically for example, if you're talking about Malaysia, like Malaysians who opt into cigarettes and who opt into that, and then therefore resulting in them having a form of disease, rather than, for example, if you reduce a whole large chunk of that, because Malaysians that generally are just a lot more prone to things like diabetes, high cholesterol, and just like lung diseases, if you're able to reduce that, perhaps we can use that like form of resource into like other things to allocate, like schools, like better things for the hospitals, better infrastructure, better treatments, and just roads. So this is able to now, like, versus you just saying that like it's expensive treatment, what you're doing here is you're proving a greater scale of impact. And this is, I think, very, very important, specifically for teams who are new, because you have the idea, you've gotten the hang of it, but you are just needing a little bit of help in just providing better analysis so that your impact just seems a whole lot more bigger, if that makes sense. Okay, now, number four is when it comes to environmental harms. So this is probably like the deputy's argument. It's something that isn't as urgent for the prime minister to speak about, but it's something that is highly valuable in the debate as well. So when we talk about environmental harms, things like the production of cigarettes, even the idea of distribution, or even the idea of people consuming it, it of course contributes to environmental degradation, right? So like for this one, I think it's pretty vague, but fairly like possible for four judges or for your opponents to be able to understand. But the grounding here is of course in the idea of cigarette butts that are non-biodegradable. And that's why you always see a form of like cigarette butts just like at some random street, or for example close by to a park, which is really sad, or even like at the parking lots, right? So this is something that is important for you to kind of flag out, which means that it's not only that people litter, but it's the idea that these particular cigarettes are non-biodegradable, which means that there is a major source of litter worldwide. So this is when the comparison becomes not only just Malaysia, but also the comparison of other countries being in the picture. So you provide the idea that it affects local ecosystems, right? The fact that this isn't like biodegradable, or the fact that even if it is small, it is just a cigarette butt, the fact is that it is able to accumulate and therefore become very, very like problematic for the environment. This one is, I think, very self-explanatory. There isn't really the most proximate strategic outcome here, but rather this is an important thing to flag out to the judge. Right. Now, let's discuss the opposition's side, which is the same motion on this House would ban smoking. The tip here that I need teams to understand is that I need you to think about what the ban on smoking does, right? Um, the question then becomes is, would this ban actually be effective in preventing smoking? Which means if Gov says all of the harms, they still need to prove if people are able to opt out of it, because if it is true that people are addicted and you have a large chunk of people addicted, how are they able to, for example, number one, transition, but how are they able to sustain that particular, premise? So the idea of efficacy becomes a really, really strategic winning point on opposition's side. Okay, so the first thing I want you to say is you do not say that smoking is good. Like there was never a burden for team opposition to kind of reject all the premises that was brought by Gov on the idea of health diseases, on the idea of all these, like, other harms that are very proximate to smokers and secondhand smokers. So there was never a burden for opposition to suddenly say, hey, smoking is a good thing. That was not your burden. But the idea that you want to bring out here is what you can see on the first point in the slide, which is even if not all smokers suffer from health issues, it is statistically far more likely to increase the risk of disease. Which means the average person is aware that smoking is quite harmful. So what you're proving here is never to say that people were unconscious or unaware as to the harms of cigarettes. They always knew about these harms, like in the first place when they first opt into cigarettes or even e-cigarettes. There was always the idea that it's going to be something that's harmful. You can see it on packaging, right? You can see it on um I don't think there's ads anymore, but you have a lot of instances that allows you to, for example, have a decent amount of information to know that smoking is a bad thing and it has harms, which proves to the judge here that on team opposition, you were able to reduce a lot of the, I guess, harms that government was saying, because it's not that you are rejecting it or you are trying to challenge it, but rather you are saying, hey, team government, this is what you're supposed to work on. The fact that people have the information, but they are unable to, for example, opt out of it, or for example, do it effectively, right? So here's a push from opposition to team government, right? So I think this is very clear, right? You shouldn't say that smoking is a good thing. That's like a red flag. And don't make that rookie mistake of always thinking that your counterfactual is something that is directly a hard stance on. You can always just, for example, in this instance, get away with this idea because, of course, it is intuitive to believe that smoking is a bad thing. So you don't have the burden to prove why it's a good thing. Say instead the idea of how smoking is a choice people can make, right? The idea here is if you know from the slide before that people were already aware and were conscious of the information or the harms that cigarettes then have, the fact that they opt into it means that there is a form of choice or a form of principle that should be present for people to make, right? So if you look into the first point here, lots of things might be harmful, but we don't ban people from doing them. So here's when there's a good, I guess, parallel that you can draw. So for example, gambling is a bad thing. Bungee jumping is something that is literally dangerous. You could actually injure yourself or kill yourself, what's worse. But people don't ban gambling. In a lot of countries, it isn't necessarily banned, right? So you draw the parallels as to how government's case doesn't necessarily work principally, right? So if you have a lot of energy or I would say spice and flair as a speaker, this is exactly the point where you are able to use that. I absolutely adore speakers who are just a lot more confident and are a lot more I guess, how do I say, happy to be able to kind of tell to the judge the probably inconsistencies and how they prove that they are right, right? So the next premise here is smoking might be bad, but it is not harmful enough to be banned completely, right? So there is a form of agency that is far more important than, for example, the things that government just said, right? So of course, choice is important. This is a big thing for government to be able to respond to. You have proven your point as team opposition. The second thing you can say is to talk about how do not say that smoking is impossible to prevent, right? Remember, we talked about the idea of efficacy, but not necessarily the idea that it will never work, because there is a form of fiat on team government. Fiat means here, the fact that you have to imagine that it works, right? There is, of course, a form of fiat the government has. The debate can't just be about, oh, it's impossible on team opposition. You still need to be charitable and engage with what they have said. Which means if you look into the first premise here is it's not necessarily impossible to prevent, because the government would allocate resources to enforce this ban. So, for example, policing public spaces. So, even if, for example, like it's not going to work in its entirety, opposition still needs to work on that engagement, because there is a form of incentive for the state to do it, especially because government just talked about like the economic harms whatsoever. So that's why there are, for example, things like public spaces that like would not allow for like cigarettes to be like there for people to smoke, right? So if you look at the second premise here is that banning smoking would likely also include banning the sale of cigarettes, right? So this is the fiat that I was talking about. So perhaps people would probably be addicted and cannot opt out. But the idea of, for example, eradicating cigarettes is possible for you to at least imagine, which means you need to engage in this, right? Which means what you can say instead is the idea of how if you were to eradicate all forms of cigarettes or you were to ban cigarettes in general, this then creates a black market for cigarettes, right? Because firstly, if you look at the first premise, some people are so addicted, they will find illegal ways to get cigarettes, right? This is the thing that I was talking about at the start of our lesson just now. When it comes to like team government proving why people are addicted, it also in a way means that it leaves like an open string for team opposition to also counter, right? Because if people are so addicted, then it also becomes problematic when they try to ban it in its entirety. So the second thing I want to look at here is that black market cigarettes are more dangerous because the government cannot inspect and regulate them, which is a problem. So if, for example, now you don't ban them, like the idea here, right? If you don't ban them, you have cigarettes, but these are cigarettes that are regulated, which means things like the ingredients in it, the way, like the conduct of like selling it, all of these things, the prices, all of these things are regulated. At the point where you ban it and people are still addicted and therefore there is still demand, it's a lot more harder for you to regulate the black market then, because they are out of the like eyes of the law, or at least harder for like government to observe and be able to inspect and regulate these instances, which means now there's a greater degree of harm that will also exist on team government. So you are proving that team government doesn't necessarily have a full-on robust case, but rather there are also going to be implications, and that's when weighing will become important, and which is more important, and that's how debate necessarily works. Okay. The third thing that you can say is to not say that some people are just too addicted, right? Like, of course, it's true. But the other side might also argue that banning is the only solution to prevent future generations from starting to smoke. So it could always just be a trade-off that government makes, and then team government just says, okay, they'll probably be super addicted and they'll probably suffer, but like they won't die out of not having nicotine at least. There will be some form of alternatives whatsoever. Which means that like there's still like a form of like weighing that can be made by team government, if that makes sense, because they are always able to, for example, say that at least we have a better generation, right? So if you say some people are too addicted, how will you then help them and help future smokers? Because like I said, in team opposition, it's not like we're saying that like smoking is a good thing. It's not that we're saying that choice in all instances is forever the best thing, right? So you don't want to be inconsistent. So the way you want to do this and what you can say instead is to talk about how this is bad for current addicts, right? This is when uh, you push on if government makes that trade-off and say that, oh, we don't care as long as people stop smoking, how this is a problem that is really, really, really big, right? So here, first premise, you can talk about how even if you ban smoking, some people are just already addicted. So if you force them to quit, they experience withdrawal effects, which then also becomes a huge, huge problem, right? So talk about like the groundings or the characterization here. How does withdrawal effect look like? So I think you learn this in science, but you can also always, have these types of information always accessible for yourself. So the withdrawal effects here is a lot. It seems that it, for example, means that people are just a lot more sluggish. People are unable to work like better, right? People, for example, are a lot more stressed, right? People now like go for other coping mechanisms like drinking or like binge eating, all of these things, right? So there's always those withdrawal effects that will be very harmful. And if you have proven that a lot of people are addicted anyway, you have a lot more people with this type of withdrawal effect. So here's when you talk about how the only solution for these people to change is for you to give that form of awareness for them that these cigarettes are insanely harmful. So even if they already know about it, we need to like have them to understand and believe in that particular like idea, right? So if you educate these addicts and like you do it in an efficient way, it means that you slowly wean them away from cigarettes. So even if that means little steps, like if they smoke like three to five cigarettes a day, they're now smoking like two cigarettes. They're still smoking, but that is still progress. So you need to do it slow rather than what team government says, which is an immediate ban on it, which is a lot more harder for people to transition, given the fact that you've proven that the withdrawal effects and how people are addicted is a massive problem that team government cannot just try to run away from. Okay, right. So there's no short break. Just give me a minute. All right, teams. All right, teams. Now let's continue with the second half of our workshop. Now, this is, I guess, a little bit more harder to conceptualize. I do feel that you should still be able to figure out what are the proximate arguments that are debatable. But I do think that this is, of course, the difficulty level is slightly higher than the previous one. So the motion that we'll be discussing, and for the purpose of this current like time slot, we're going to talk about the government side, which is on the motion of this house would reserve 30% of the parliament for women specifically. So let's just look at the motion in general before we get into government side or opposition side. I want you to firstly understand that this is a policy debate, which means you should be able to set up the debate. Like what exactly does the reserve of 30% of the parliament of women look like? It means that perhaps you would have like, if in the 100% of the parliament with the 222 seats, you would have 30% of them being women. I can't do the calculation. I'm pretty bad at math, but like the idea here is that you would have 30% of that 100 full percent to be women in the parliament, and then probably the rest would be male. But there is a literal policy, there's a literal requirement now for it to at least be 30% with women in the parliament. So yeah, that's very, very important to note, right? So yeah, now let's move on to team government side. Also, I'll be explaining to you guys later on. Oh, also later I'll be explaining to you guys what could be the case on team opposition and how they're able to come up with the counterfactual. Okay. So now, when it comes to team government, when we talk about having a 30% of um, women in the parliament, the first thing you can think about, which is the most intuitive and literally a very, very strong argument, is the idea on representation, right? For example, just the idea that we need women in those spaces, right? And we want to then like improve the representation. So if you notice here, we're talking about the improvement of that representation. So even if Opposition says, hey, we do have like women in the parliament. Yes, it's true, but we need an improved representation. We need more women in the parliament, right? So that's the first thing in terms of strategy that you want to be able to flag out. So two premise here, right? The first premise or the first point talks about how women have historically faced difficulties in politics due to gender stereotypes and discrimination. Now, this is a very, very important like I guess thing to note, especially when you're talking about representation, because when we talk about representation, there are always struggles as to why we want to give these platforms for these minorities. And of course, women are one of the minorities that is within this discussion that we're having right now. So let's talk about like what are these like struggles and like difficulties that they have to go through. And what I want you guys to pay attention here is that it comes into the perspective of politics. So things like being able to vote, things like, for example, how they need to have representation so that you have better protection for the women on the ground, for like average women on the ground, right? So this is when you need to be able to ground it, right? And you should be able to come up with these things, even if you think that, oh, they're super self-explanatory. I think it's important for teams to be able to characterize these important things to the judges to show a form of urgency as to why they, for example, chose this as a first argument, right? The second thing here is the idea of quota, because 30% then becomes like literally a quota. It's a form of affirmative action. So when you implement this quota, which is 30%, right? Which by the way isn't even a like 50%, right? It's not even fully quality type of representation, right? I think that's self-explanatory, but I just thought I wanted to say that, right? So if you implement a quota, it means that we guarantee that a sufficient number of women will be in parliament. So without this quota, without the number of 30%, probably certain women who exist under team opposition is just a form of tokenism. Like they exist, but is it effective? Is it a true representation? Is there like a tipping point if they're there or if they're not there? Right? So the idea of having this quota means that you have a form of certainty or a form of guarantee, as the slide suggests, that you have sufficient number of women who will then be in parliament and how this is valuable. So this is when you are able to make a form of comparative, right? The parallel of having 10 women under team opposition or having maybe like 20 women under team opposition, because it does not mean that team government says that team opposition has zero women representation, but we're talking about how we need a sufficient number of women in parliament. So if you do the calculation, let me try to do the calculation actually. So that's about like 66, 66, 67 women in parliament. So you have like about 67 women in the parliament versus maybe just 20 women that opposition says, right? So that's a form of guarantee, a form of certainty that there's a large chunk or at least a decent amount of women in parliament. Now, the second thing, I kind of already like gave a little hint about it as I was going through the previous slide, is the fact that when you have 30% or this particular quota of women in parliament, you also have a better like form of like change or a better degree in terms of helping women issues, right? So this is very, very important because if you look into the two things, like the two premises available on the slide right now, firstly, it says male politicians cannot fully relate to women issues. What are these issues? Things like gender pay gap, things like abortion rights, things like sexual harassment. And these are things that exist specifically as a struggle for women. So like, I'm not necessarily like saying that these are things that men never went through, but specifically for politicians, male politicians who exist in the parliament, it's harder for them to be able to relate to these particular things. And the metric of relatability goes a really, really long way, because when we talk about women issues, it means that we need a politician who is able to represent, but also create these forms of policies for us. And the idea here is that we have a lot of women on the ground, like just normal citizens who require the form of relatability from politicians so that these politicians are able to voice out the concerns that people on the ground, like women on the ground, have. So things like pay gap. If it was a male politician who did that, it's harder for them to identify like struggles like being a mom, struggles like needing to also have a career, struggles like like income, stuff like that, things like abortion rights. Regardless of the context being super conservative or super progressive, the idea here is that even if it's pro-life or pro-choice, we need a woman being there. We need women, like 60 plus of them, to be able to voice out these particular things, right? And when it comes to sexual harassment, it also exists in like, works, like working places, all of those things. So we need people who are able to relate. Therefore, we need the quota to exist, right? So women politicians have personally suffered from these issues. They are more likely to advocate for change. Now, this is very similar to what I just explained just now, but here's when you can also do a form of weighing, right? In parliament, you also need support, even from like other politicians. And maybe opposition has 10 to 20 women in parliament, but if you kind of like make those 20 women versus like 200 other men, it's really hard. So not to say that 60 plus is the best way to get majority, that's still not the majority, but the idea here is that we have a lot more people proving the concern that women have, and it's important to have that quota to be able to, in a way, show a form of mobility, right? Like provide to you the degree of impact, and that can only come when you have the quota of 30%. Now, let's get to the third one. So the third one is you also need to create role models. So if we think about it right now, right? If we think of presidents or prime minister, usually the first one that comes to our head is not really a woman, right? It's most often a male like leader, which means that this becomes a really, really important like argument for team government to talk about. For example, first premise here, by having more prominent women in leadership positions, we create positive role models for other women. So, irregardless of you wanting to ground this debate with like Malaysia's politics, with like the US or other countries' politics, the idea here is you still require women to be platformed. Like literally how the picture looks like. We need women to be out there, like standing, so that other women around, other girls, younger girls, they're able to look up to these particular like female leaders and make them become the role models. So you can talk about like the role models that we have. Like you see, like in Malaysia, we have Wanaziza, we have Iza, we have a lot of these like individuals who are very few. So if we can have a quota, then that becomes a lot more clearer, that becomes a lot more solid in terms of like girls or women being able to now choose or select their role models, because it's not just too scarce, right? The second I guess premise here is that this is a stepping stone for more women to participate in politics when they feel like they can succeed. So not exactly an inside knowledge, but I think it's very like I guess even for you guys, you should be able to kind of know, right? That a lot of people agree that like politics is just a hard place. Like it's hard to get by, it's hard to climb up the social ladder whatsoever. And if you have women being a part of that, being able to reach that like triumph, right? I think it's really, really, really valuable. So being able to create this particular weighing as team gov is important, because um this could be something that is a lot more exclusive on team government, right? You have the quota, it means that people want to opt in because there's a higher chance that they will be taken in versus whatever team opposition says, which has a mechanism that is probably a little bit more volatile. Okay. Now, let's discuss the opposition's side with the same motion, right? Now, the tip here is I want you guys to be able to think about side government's solution, because they say that this 30% quota is literally the solution to a lot of problems that women deal with. They talk about issues like policies, they talk about representation, they talk about like role models, as if this one reserve of 30% is able to solve all these problems. This is when, if you are in team opposition, going into prep or even just going into the debate room, you have to think about like, are there problems with this? Or are there other ways that you are able to achieve this outcome? Because this doesn't just mean that you're able to co-opt a lot of the benefits Gov says, but you're also able now to weigh what is more important, what is a lot more approximate, what are the actors' incentive, right? All of these things then becomes a lot more accessible at the point in which you are able to think about whether you are able to solve the problem or not. So now, the first thing I want you guys to talk about is to not exactly say that you will reserve a greater number. Don't suddenly say, oh, we're going to do 50% equality all the way. This is not a British parliamentary debate, so you don't have to be too desperate, I would say. So if you argue that you want to reserve a number of seats for women, for example, 40% or 50%, then you agree with government side that reserving seats for women is important. And that means the debate becomes parallel. Now the judge is just like, oh, 30% or 40%. Like the difference or the distinction is fairly too little. So what you want to talk about here instead is to talk about how women should be voted in naturally. So if people vote for them and we have 80, 80 women in parliament, that's a good thing, right? We don't cap or reserve it only at 30%. So the premise here is firstly, having a quota to reserve seats for women in parliament is forced, right? The idea here is that it is something that happens drastically. You then require and you need like 67 politicians, female politicians, to be the best of the best to now suddenly exist, right? So there's a form of problem there, which brings us nicely into the second premise of we prefer for this change to be organic, which is society will slowly become more accepting and women can rise at the top. Here's when you can ground and provide to the judge how are people now transitioning with the idea of women being in the picture. So it looks like you know, in the working environment, how you now have a lot more policies meant for women, right? It looks like things, how our votes are just as equal as men. It looks like the awareness of domestic abuse, the things like women being leaders, the international lens as to how women now, like, there is a form of like enforcement specifically to prioritize women rights in these instances, which means to prove that there is awareness and that there is a high probability that people will slowly but surely buy into this idea. Not to say that people will not become super progressive, but just how there is a trend of it changing, right? Now, the second thing then is don't say that women are not good leaders, especially not in front of me. I will be very, very annoyed with that. But I won't be biased. I'm just saying it won't make me happy. So the idea of how don't say that women are not good leaders is firstly is just simply sexist and untrue. Like that's untrue, right? We have lots of leaders around the world who are women. But you should not make a statement that generalize a certain group of people. And that's like an important tip in debating, specifically for rookie teams as well. Don't generalize if you cannot prove, right? Even if your impact or your premise is small, it's super tiny, but you just prove it till you make it, that's still better than generalizing a group of people but not able to prove it, right? So the idea here is the second point here is what if they are good enough, but they are just not given chances to prove themselves, right? When it comes to meritocracy, like, does that get us somewhere? Does that mean that like women are actually just as good as male politicians or male leaders, for example? So what you can see instead is we will not get the most qualified people, right? Because now the quota just means that, oh, just fill in it ASAP. We need about 67 politicians who are women, sit, right? But if you do it naturally on team opposition, it means that women politicians who are qualified, if they are super qualified, then they will be voted in on either side anyway. So you would still get like those good politicians, those good women politicians on the opposition side. We never said that it was not going to exist. Because if this woman was so good and super qualified, like merits on point, things like being able to engage in like, you know, with the people, stuff like that, still good, then they will still be elected under team opposition as well. So therefore, their side gives power to women who would otherwise not be voted in. This is unfair and unmeritocratic. So perhaps 67 can exist under team government, but perhaps only the good ones, or at least the like top of the class is only like 20 people, and then you have 40 other people who are just there, which means it's still tokenistic at best. But in opposition, it's natural. So you have a lot more people who get into the office because they are good. Okay. Now, the third thing here is don't say that this policy will never happen because, like I said, this is fiat, like similarly into the first motion we talked about. This is fiat, right? Fiat assumes that the concept in the motion will happen. You have to kind of buy into the idea that it's probably going to work, right? So this has happened, right? Like literally this debate has happened. This is just to prove, like, even if you don't want to do with this fiat, just please engage with it because it has happened in Bangladesh with where they reserve 50 out of 350 seats in parliament specifically for women. Amazing. Okay. Now, what you can see instead is that this policy would invite backlash. So if we look into the 220 seats in Malaysia, and let's say you have 67 women, the majority would still be men anyway. And the idea here is that if you have these men resisting, like giving backlash, that's worse, right? So if you look into the two premise here, firstly, is if society is conservative and sexist, then people would be upset at this change. Many may criticize women, saying they don't deserve this, which is a problem because you have 67 seats under team government, but they are always questioned. And you have these like, misogynist, like super far right male men just like going against these women, for example, every single time they try to speak. So it's a problem, right? Which means this is acceptable to argue as it doesn't go against fiat. So you're not saying that it cannot happen. Oh, you're not saying that it cannot happen. You're saying that it's going to invite backlash. Can you see it? Like, so here you can talk a little bit about efficacy, right? About the scale of impact, about whether you are able to tip the scale or not, all of those things, right? So in summary, firstly, you need to probably defend what your side wants you to defend. Don't squirrel the motion. Like in the second motion, don't suddenly say you will do 40% or 50%. That's against the heart of the debate. So defend it properly as to what the motion or as to the heart of the debate, how you're supposed to defend it. Number two, don't be too extreme with your argument. Be realistic and try to think to yourself, would the average person believe what I'm saying? Like if you say that like, oh, cigarettes is a good thing, like that's very extreme. Like how are people able to believe that, right? So always ask yourself as you are preparing during prep, or if you just suddenly thought of this idea in the round, question yourself again, ask your teammates if that is really a possible thing. The last thing is ask yourself, are there other ways to solve the problem? If so, what are these other ways and why are they better or worse than your solution? And this is very, very like valuable when you are preparing, like during prep time. And you need that teammate who kind of questions and asks you. Or for example, you need that little voice that talks to yourself, whether it's a good thing or not, right? And this only comes with practice, and this only comes when you are getting the hang of it. So remember, at the end of the day, debate is a challenge of persuasion. You need to make sure that people feel convinced by what you are arguing, even if they may not have originally agreed with your opinions. That's why it's not a public speaking speech. It's really just engaging and being charitable and working the best or the worst case of the other team or your team as well, right? Whoever is the best at persuading the audience and the judge wins, right? So thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in and just like, watching this workshop with me. I hope that you guys have a good weekend at Malaya Interschools and hope to see you guys. Bye bye.